In the frozen hours before dawn, the silence was broken by the roar of artillery. Within minutes, columns of steel moved across unseen borders, and entire cities braced for impact. What many believed would end in days became something far more brutal, a prolonged struggle that reshaped landscapes and lives. Strategies collapsed almost immediately. Trenches carved into the black soil of the East echoed wars long past. Nights grew endless, measured not in hours but in cycles of fire and fleeting moments of quiet. And in those silences, imagination proved as dangerous as any weapon. Commanders talk of supply lines and counteroffensives, but soldiers on the line whisper of what moves when the smoke clears, what they glimpse in the fog between shellings, what they swear they hear in the static of their radios. Among these whispers is one name that belongs less to the present than to the past: the Mavka. A spirit from Ukrainian folklore, a woman not alive but not gone, said to walk where the dead have not yet been buried. And now, in this war, soldiers claim she has returned, no longer confined to forests and rivers, but appearing in the mud of trenches, in the very heart of the battlefield. The Mavka has become a paradox. Spirit and soldier, protector and predator, resistance in a form older than any army. She is not only remembered in folk tales, but spoken of in patrol reports and midnight conversations. And whether illusion, trauma, or something real, her legend has taken root again, not in villages by the forest, but in the very mud of the battlefield. Skeptics argue that these sightings are nothing but exhaustion, nerves stretched too thin. Others point to shared accounts, men who swear they saw the same thing at the same time. If it were only imagination, why does it keep repeating across different units, in different places? Perhaps it is only trauma, or perhaps the old stories were never only stories. The first recorded account of the Mavka in the trenches comes from an infantryman stationed outside a ruined farming village near Donetsk in the winter of 2022. For clarity, we will call him Orest. His testimony was delivered in precise detail, without embellishment, the kind of account soldiers give when reporting an engagement, not a story meant to entertain. He had fought in other conflicts before, but what happened in Ukraine was unlike anything he had ever faced. His unit was holding a defensive line at the edge of a marsh. Snow lay in uneven drifts, covering shell holes and the remains of collapsed dugouts. By January, the temperature fell well below freezing each night, the kind of cold that stiffened rifles and turned breath into smoke. On one such night, shortly after 3 a.m., Orest was on watch with 2 other men. Their orders were simple: hold the line, observe the perimeter, and report any movement before dawn. Through his night vision scope, Orest scanned the reed beds marking the edge of the swamp. The wind bent the stalks in constant motion, creating shifting shapes that tested the eyes. But one form remained perfectly still, upright, human in outline. Too still to be mistaken for reeds, it stood watching, unbothered by the gusts that moved everything else around it. Orest whispered to the man beside him. "You see that?" The second soldier raised his binoculars, scanned, and shook his head. Fog, nothing there. But when handed the scope, his silence gave him away. After a pause, he muttered, "Yes, something's out there." Together they observed the figure. Even through the glow of optics, it seemed to tilt its head as if acknowledging them. Orest thought it looked like a woman, slight build, hair hanging loose, a pale blur fixed against the dark. At 3:17 a.m., the report went over radio. Outpost 4, possible civilian movement on the north perimeter. Repeat, possible civilian movement. Command's reply came clipped and cold. Outpost 4, hold position. The figure lingered nearly 10 minutes, neither approaching nor retreating. The men debated whether to fire, uncertain if what they saw was real flesh or nothing at all. Just as the tension peaked, the figure vanished. No retreat, no movement. One moment present, the next gone, as though the fog had swallowed it whole. The rest of the night passed in silence, but at dawn, the patrol advanced to the reed bed. That was when they discovered a single line of footprints pressed into the snow. They were small, unmistakably human, and bare. The prints led from the marsh directly toward the trench line. They stopped abruptly a few meters from the wire. No return trail, no scatter to the side, just an ending, as if whoever left them had dissolved into the air mid-step. The three men who saw it swore to the same details. The prints were real. No one in the abandoned village could have made them, and no one could have survived barefoot in the cold. Officially, the incident was dismissed as nerves, the product of exhaustion and stress. But among those present, the impression never faded. One soldier later put it simply, "We fight rockets, drones, and men with rifles. Those I understand. But the ground doesn't lie." It recorded her steps. And then nothing. A second account emerged in the spring of 2023 from a forward trench line outside Lyman, held by a mixed unit of Ukrainian troops and foreign volunteers. The conditions were miserable. April rains had turned the clay into deep mud, filling dugouts and drowning rifles left uncovered. Fog hung so heavy at night that men said it swallowed their flashlights whole. One night, just before 11:40 p.m., two soldiers were assigned to radio watch. A Ukrainian operator known by the call sign Sova, the Owl, and a foreign volunteer veteran identified only as Miller. Their task was routine, monitoring encrypted frequencies for enemy chatter or incoming coordinates. That was when they caught the first irregularity. A faint voice broke through static. At first it seemed like the usual distortion, but soon both men froze. It was female, calm, too clear to be interference, and it was speaking a name. At first, Sova thought it might be coincidence, but then the voice repeated, sharper this time, unmistakable. It was his name. Miller confirmed what he was hearing. He leaned close to the set as the whisper shifted, now pronouncing his surname, drawn out slowly, syllable by syllable. There were no women anywhere in their sector, and no one outside the unit knew both names. Their frequencies were encrypted, locked to their channel. Yet the voice knew them. Sova tried cycling the dial. Each time he switched channels, the static cleared for a heartbeat, only for the same voice to return. Always female. Always repeating names. Sometimes his, sometimes Miller's. At 11:52 p.m., Miller broke protocol. "Command, this is Outpost 5. We are receiving interference on all channels. Unknown source." The reply was immediate, but routine. "Outpost 5, interference acknowledged. Continue monitoring, report if content changes." But the content had already changed. By 11:58 p.m., the voice was no longer confined to the headset. Sova claimed he could hear it in the trench itself, as though someone stood in the fog behind them, whispering his name in his own ear. Miller confirmed he heard it too. They raised their rifles, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. The men admitted later that the silence between each repetition was worse than the words themselves. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the voice stopped. The bombardment began just after 1 a.m., less than 2 hours after Miller and Sova had logged the strange transmission of the female voice repeating their names. At first, they thought the artillery was just another harassing barrage, the kind they had endured before. But within minutes, it was clear this was different. A curtain of fire slammed into their sector, shaking the trench walls until they split and caved. Shells detonated in rolling succession, turning the night into strobing light. Darkness, then blinding white, over and over, so quickly it felt like the earth itself was pulsing. The air was thick with cordite and dust, choking lungs and burning eyes. Radios spat half-words drowned in static, reports of armor sighted, flanking fire, requests for support unanswered. By 1:20 a.m., and a section of the trench where the comms post stood had collapsed. Miller and Sova were driven back with the others, clutching what equipment they could carry. Mud poured in like water, burying sandbags, swallowing rifles. The secondary trench was no safer. It had been cratered by direct hits. panic began to spread. Some men shouted to break for open ground, to risk the fields rather than be entombed alive. Others argued that anyone who left the trench would be cut down instantly by drones overhead. Amid that chaos, Miller swore he saw something through the shifting smoke. A figure. Pale. Still. Upright among the falling earth, as if untouched by the storm around it. Miller swore the figure stood in the smoke where no human could. The crater was still burning, the soil too hot to hold weight. Yet she remained upright, pale and silent, her hair loose, her outlines sharpened by each flare. Then the radios came alive again. The same calm, feminine voice from earlier, not static, not distortion. This time, it gave no names. It gave commands. Left! Move left! The words cut through the chaos with surgical precision. Men froze, staring at their sets as if they might explode. Then the order came again, louder. Left, now. One squad shifted reluctantly, stumbling into the collapsed section just as a shell obliterated the ground they had occupied seconds before. The trench shook with the impact. Debris rained down, but the men who had moved were alive. Forward 20 meters. Tunnel. Proceed. Sova nearly dropped his headset. The voice was steady, insistent, repeating the directions as though reading from a map no one else could see. He looked to Miller, who nodded once, pale and rigid. Together they relayed the instructions. Right. Take cover in the forest edge. Move. Each phrase came in sequence, almost anticipating the next strike. Shells landed where they had been, never where they had gone. At one point, the voice ordered, "Stop! Stay down!" They obeyed, and seconds later, a drone-mounted munition tore overhead, detonating exactly in the space where they would have advanced. The men were silent now, too shaken to question. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered that they were being led to their deaths. But step by step they followed, because staying in place meant dying where they stood. The soldiers moved in staggered formation, each step dictated by the voice that bled from their headsets. The bombardment had not slackened. Shells continued to fall in steady rhythm, each explosion painting the night in red and white. Yet none struck the path they followed. Advance, 20 meters. Stop. The commands came clipped, precise, as though issued by a trained officer. Miller noted later that the tone carried no panic, no urgency, only certainty. It was the kind of voice men obey because disobedience feels impossible. Sova kept his radio pressed close. Twice, when they hesitated, the voice repeated itself until they complied. At one point, she ordered them into a shallow depression barely wide enough to cover 3 men. They crowded into the mud, confused. Seconds later, a drone released its payload directly onto the ground they had vacated. The blast would have killed them all. One of the younger soldiers, barely 20, muttered prayers in Ukrainian, swearing aloud that this was no specter, but an angel. Others still cursed, saying they were walking into a trap, that the next command would lead them into their graves. But even they obeyed, not because they trusted the voice, but because disobeying meant standing still, waiting for the next shell to find them. The figure in the smoke remained just within sight, visible whenever flares lit the battlefield. She never moved quickly, never ran, but her outline always aligned with the path given through the radios. To some, it felt like following a map written by the land itself. Finally, after what felt like hours compressed into minutes, the voice gave one last order. Forward, tunnel entrance. Proceed now. At first, no one believed it. The entrance she spoke of had been abandoned, its location half forgotten. Yet when they reached the coordinates, they found the timber-lined mouth of the old service tunnel, still intact, concealed by debris and overgrowth. The entrance yawned before them, a jagged wound in the earth shored up by rotting timber. Few remembered it even existed. Most had assumed it collapsed years earlier, but now it gaped wide, just large enough for men to crawl inside. Inside. Move now. The command carried through the radios again, clear and sharp. None hesitated this time. One by one, they ducked into the tunnel, the stench of damp soil and mold closing around them. The air was so thick it felt alive, pressing against lungs and skin. The space was narrow. Men scraped helmets on the beams as they pushed forward. Water dripped from the ceiling, pooling ankle deep. Somewhere above, the bombardment raged on, each impact shaking dust down in thin cascades. The tunnel seemed ready to collapse with every strike. In the dark, some swore they heard more than artillery, a woman's footsteps ahead, a faint hum, like a lullaby, guiding them forward. Sova whispered that he saw a pale glow, just at the edge of vision, though others saw nothing. Still, the voice returned whenever the unit faltered. Continue. Forward. Do not stop. When a section of the tunnel forked into two passages, confusion broke out. Men argued in hushed tones, uncertain which way to turn. Then the command cut through again. Left. Proceed. They obeyed. Later, when engineers inspected the site, they found the right-hand passage had collapsed entirely, blocked by soil and timber. Following the voice had been their only chance. By the time the men reached the far exit, dawn was bleeding into the sky. Behind them, the trench they had abandoned was gone, flattened under layers of artillery strikes. The ground where they had stood hours earlier was nothing but a smoking crater. The men staggered out of the tunnel one by one, blinking against the thin wash of morning. Boots sank into wet soil, faces were the color of ash. Behind them, the ground still murmured with distant impacts, but in front of them, there was only the fragile stillness that follows, surviving something you were certain would kill you. No one spoke at first. They simply counted heads, touching shoulders, checking names. Most were there, more than anyone expected. Some called it luck. Others said the barrage had shifted by chance, but the pattern was too exact for accident. Moves ordered seconds before impact, halts that spared them from munitions they never saw, a route uncovered that no map had marked. In their statements, the men kept circling the same line without quite saying it. Someone had known where to place them, and someone had known when. A few were willing to say more. One man swore that, inside the tunnel, he saw a woman moving ahead of the column, hair unbound, never stumbling, her outline just clear enough to follow when their lamps failed. Another claimed a cold hand forced him down moments before a drone-borne charge ripped the air where his head had been. Miller wrote only this: orders were issued, not by command. Intelligence later reviewed intercepts from the opposite side of the line. In several recordings, enemy operators reported a female voice bleeding onto their nets during the same window. It did not give directions. It whispered names. Some of those names appeared again hours later on casualty lists. For them, the voice signaled confusion and fear. For the men who walked out of the tunnel, it had been precision and escape. Official paperwork filed the whole affair under unexplained interference and fortuitous withdrawal. The language was clean, the night was not. Off the record, the survivors told a different version, one in which the old stories had stepped out of the forest and into the trench, speaking through radios and smoke. They would not agree on what she was. They agreed on what she did. If the Mavka walks with them, calling names, issuing orders, then the argument is no longer about belief. It is about allegiance. And on nights like this, it seems the land itself has chosen a side. In the weeks that followed, the men who had walked out of the tunnel were redeployed. Their sector was written off as a loss, the ground too pulverized to hold. On paper, the withdrawal was described in clinical terms: unit successfully extracted under heavy bombardment. No mention of the radio voice, no mention of the figure in the smoke. Yet off the record, the story refused to die. Soldiers repeated it around cookfires, in dim basements where they sheltered from shelling, in the rare moments of calm when cigarettes were passed down the line. Each retelling carried the same details. The voice that called names, the orders that saved them, the figure glimpsed in the haze. Some added more. A pale hand touching a shoulder, a glow that moved just ahead in the tunnel. But the core never shifted. For the men themselves, explaining what happened became almost impossible. They disagreed on what they had seen, but they did not disagree on surviving. Without the voice, without the figure, they would not have reached daylight. That fact united them, even as their words fractured. Word spread to other units. Men who had never set foot in Bakhmut began speaking of the Mavka as though she had always been present. In some versions, she appeared in the forest, warning patrols of ambushes. In others, she walked the trench lines, her hair damp with rain, calling men away from the exact spot a shell would strike minutes later. Skeptics rolled their eyes, but even they began to recognize how widespread the story had become. The command structure tolerated the whispers, but privately discouraged them. Officers noted that morale seemed strangely stronger in units that believed the Mavka was on their side. Men fought harder, dug deeper, endured longer, convinced that the land itself had given them a guardian. But official reports never acknowledged her. The line between folklore and fact had no place in paperwork. Still, fragments crept into the margins. Logs that mentioned unexplained transmission, diaries recovered from the dead, with sketches of a pale woman walking the trenches. Radio operators in distant sectors swearing that their encrypted lines sometimes carried a faint echo. A woman's voice speaking in Ukrainian, repeating names. For every story of salvation, there were others of dread. Enemy prisoners muttered about the same voice, but for them, it carried doom. They spoke of comrades who fled into the dark after hearing their names called, never to return. Of drones that lost signal when the whisper cut across frequencies. Of morale cracking when they realized the battlefield itself seemed to speak against them. By the end of that summer, the Mavka was no longer only folklore. She had become a presence soldiers measured themselves against. Some prayed to her, some cursed her. Some claimed she was nothing but exhaustion given form. Yet all agreed that the war no longer belonged to men alone. In archives, wars are reduced to arrows and dates. The paper is clean even when the soil is not. Years from now, someone will read a line that says a unit withdrew under heavy bombardment and assume they understand what happened. They will not feel the heat of the crater. They will not hear a voice speaking names no machine should know. They will not picture a figure standing where no human could stand, pointing toward a tunnel no one remembered. That is why testimonies like these matter. Not because they solve anything, but because they refuse to be erased. Call the incidents interference if you prefer. Call them exhaustion, or a trick of fear stretching nerves to the limit. Yet in sector after sector, the same pattern repeats. A voice cuts through encrypted channels. Orders arrive seconds before the blast. Names are spoken in a tone no map can annotate. If this is only fatigue, it is strangely organized. If this is only myth, it is unusually precise. The legend has reshaped itself for the present. The Mavka of old tales lured wanderers into the forest. The Mavka of the trenches seems to lead the living out. She is not a mascot and not a miracle. She is the shape that endurance takes when a people are pushed to the edge and still refuse to yield. For some, she is superstition wearing a uniform. For others, she is the land itself. Mud, smoke, and memory, fighting beside them. There are patterns worth noting. Reports of the voice often coincide with weather that muffles sound: fog, sleet, ground-hugging smoke. The orders are simple: left, right, stop, proceed, never more than what a man can follow while the world collapses. The phenomenon rarely appears when communication is stable. It arrives when lines are down, when batteries falter, when command is silent. A cynic would say, soldiers hear what they need to hear. Perhaps. But the ground keeps confirming what the radios claim, and men keep living who would otherwise be counted differently. On the other side of the line, the same presence looks different. Intercepts hint at panic, unfamiliar syllables threading into headsets, the sensation of being watched from the tree line. a pale outline in the haze that will not yield to optics. Where one force finds a corridor through fire, the other stumbles into it. Where one hears movement, the other hears its own name. Spirit or story, the effect is measurable in outcomes. Men guided out, positions held longer than the math predicted, assaults that falter when morale breaks for reasons no report will list. We should say what we cannot say in official language, that some survivors believe they were not alone in the trench, that they felt a hand press them down a heartbeat before shrapnel tore the air above, that they walked in file because a calm voice told them to live. None of this will satisfy the part of the mind that asks for coordinates and signatures. It is not meant to. The battlefield is not a lab. It swallows evidence and leaves only fragments, scorched earth, bent antennae, a line in a notebook that reads, "Stop, stay down," and a man who is still alive because he obeyed it. If there is an answer, it sits somewhere between radio theory and the superstition of those who do not have the luxury of disbelief. Perhaps the Mavka is only the echo of 1,000 decisions to endure, gathered into a single image the mind can hold. Perhaps she is precisely what the oldest songs warned about, except that in this era she has chosen different ground. The forest has not vanished. It has moved into the trench. So the question that remains is not whether she exists. It is why the same presence keeps appearing where resistance is strongest. Why the voice favors simple orders that preserve life. Why the myth refuses to fade even where satellites look down and declare that nothing is left to see. If myths are tools people build to carry weight too heavy to hold alone, then here is a tool forged under bombardment, passed hand to hand in whispers. She walks with us. If myths are more than that, then this is something older. Older than coordinates. Older than maps. Older than the idea that land can be taken without the land answering back. In the end, all we can do is record the pattern faithfully. Names spoken, orders given, men who return when nothing suggested they would. The papers will file it under anomalies and move on. The living will not. They will carry the night inside them, and with it a certainty they cannot explain, that when everything else failed, the earth itself took their side. Thank you for walking this line with me, where war meets folklore and testimony refuses to be quiet. At Dr. Crow, we document the stories that don't fit in reports, not to prove, but to preserve. If this investigation spoke to you, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it with someone who thinks the map is the whole war. It isn't. The ground remembers more than we admit. Until the next operation, watch the skies, trust your instincts, and remember, silence on the radio does not mean you are alone. Some voices do not need permission to speak.